Perfect.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to Becoming an Ally, a webinar looking into allyship along with power structures and privilege. My name is Kelly Squire. I'm the program manager for Communities for Gender Equality. I'm very excited to be learning alongside of you today. Today, I'm speaking to you from my home in Greater Napanee, which is situated on the land of the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We're neighbors to the Mohawk Nation and Tyendinaga. I grew up in this area, once so closely situated and connected to a First Nation, and yet I knew so little about the vibrant and sustainable community in my youth. It was not recognized or acknowledged, and so little was shared about the history of the land. Truthfully, I know very little about my European ancestors. I do not know their stories or their reasons for choosing to settle on Turtle Island, but I do know that their survival was dependent on the destruction of Indigenous nations. I acknowledge the truth of our colonial history, and I'm committed to pushing for systemic change, unlearning what I thought I knew, and learning what I should have been taught in school as a child. I am committed to teaching my own young son about the history of our country and how we can show respect to the original stewards of this land. I invite you to share in the chat where you're situated today. Before we dive into our webinar today, I do want to go over some housekeeping details. A friendly Zoom reminder. We are in meeting format. You can see and hear us, and we can see and hear you. Feel free to keep your video on if you like, but please do keep yourself muted throughout the presentation until opportunities for discussion. This way we can all hear Ruth without any interruptions. If you have any questions throughout the session, please pop them into the chat box. We'll be incorporating and collecting your questions for a short Q&A at the end, time permitting. For interpretation, this session is available both in English and French. To access the French and English interpretation, you will see the globe at the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that globe, you can switch between French and English. You will also be able to click view options at the very top. And under shared screens, you can choose to see different screens. Now, I am so excited to welcome back our friend Ruth Mojeed-Ramirez. Our CGE cohort has been on a learning journey with Ruth the past few months. I'm so excited for this opportunity to connect and learn today. For those who don't know Ruth, she's the Chief Equity Officer for the Inclusion Project. The Inclusion Project aims to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in Canadian society by actively engaging partners and decision makers through research, knowledge, development, and community. In her role, Ruth's research, engagement, and solutions design focus on an intersectional and intergenerational approach to address complex issues of race, decolonization, and gender equity. She leads organizational REDI strategy, development, and coaching among multi-level stakeholders in the public and private sectors. Ruth will also be joined by a member of our network, Jamba Kofi, and Jamba is an award-winning community leader, author, poet, public speaker, and amateur musician. Originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, he has lived and traveled in multiple countries in East and Southern Africa, Western Europe, and North America. He currently works as the Grants and Community Initiatives Manager at Vancouver Foundation. Inspired by lived experience, he taught seminars focused on the refugee experience during the 2019 Yale Young Global Scholars Program at Yale University. I would like to pass it over to you, Ruth. Thank you so much for sharing this space with us to learn and discuss allyship.
Kelly, thank you so very much, and welcome everyone. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks to all of the team at the Learning Institute and largely the Community Foundations of Canada. We're doing things slightly different today. Those of you who have been part of this journey with us, we have a format, and typically we like to go with having a structure where it's a lot more interactive than just having slides in front of you. So we're going to be doing a bit more of that today. But Kelly, I have to say, just listening to you reflect on your own journey and everything that's led to your sojourn, if I would call it that, on these lands, and how the history and where it's lacking, how all of that has come together to be part of your experience. I think that's a story that maybe many of us in the room today would share. When I come into spaces like this, I typically am tempted to kind of open up the floodgates and invite people to share about what that journey was like for them. Is this a case where you have that same history, or is your history one that you can pinpoint on a quick map, or whatever histories and stories have been told to you? But all of that just to get us to take some time to reflect on what it means to be on these lands. Who are the people that we are disenfranchising, if you may, by being on this land? And when it's not us directly, are there ways that we continue to contribute to historical ills and situations that contribute to that? As Kelly mentioned, I'm with an organization called the Inclusion Project. Through the work of the Inclusion Project, I have the opportunity to work with fantastic institutions like the Community Foundations of Canada. Home for us is on the unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, otherwise known as Victoria, on Vancouver Island, BC. And then we've got people who work across different parts of the country we call Canada. All of that privilege we do not take for granted in any way. And again, much like Kelly was sharing, reflecting on my own journey as an immigrant, in this case, a first generation immigrant to Canada. From time to time, I get opportunities to really think about some of the chances that have been afforded to me, some of the opportunities, if you may, that allow me to be in spaces like this today. But as I mentioned, we're doing this slightly differently today. And I see in the chat, some people are already sharing about where they're joining from. I'll encourage you to please do so. If anything, it helps us. It helps to strengthen the bond and to know, to once again realize how connected we all are. So thank you again for continuing to prioritize this. So as I mentioned, we're doing things differently today. I will not be using slides for those who have been following this, and instead we're just going to jump right into the conversation. And those of you who joined us this time last month, you'd remember that we had two amazing speakers, one of them being the incredible Jabba Kofi, who has graciously agreed to be here today, and he is on the screen somewhere. Thanks to Zoom, sometimes it feels like we're a big sea of people. Yeah, there's Jabba. I see Jabba. Hi, Jabba. Thanks again for joining us today.
Of course, Ruth, it's a pleasure. And thank you, everybody, for being here.
Absolutely. And Kelly read your bio earlier, and knowing you personally, I know that bio doesn't do justice to what the history has been and everything that you bring into a space like this. Again, those who were with us last month, I'm sure they can recollect some of the powerful insights that you shared with us at the time. And now we're talking about becoming an ally. What does that mean? What does that mean to you personally? And I hope that, even as we listen to Jabba share with us today, that each and every one of us will take some time to reflect on some of these things and possibly share in the chat. And I'm going to encourage as well in the chat, please feel free to send in your questions and share those insights as they come alive to you. But Jabba, so you're here with us today to talk about allyship, what it means to become one. But let's start from the very starting point. What exactly does that word connote when we talk about allyship? What does it mean?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. So first, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you all from Vancouver, from Kerrisdale specifically. It's on the unceded territories of the Musqueam people. Vancouver itself is on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And that's important to acknowledge, especially in a conversation like this, where we are talking about allyship. Allyship starts by recognizing where you are and your positionality, where you are at. So while I don't have like a direct definition of allyship, I'm pretty sure Google might do a better job than I can defining the word itself. For me, when I hear that allyship, I hear that acknowledgement of where one is and actually doing the work to continue making like things better, to uplift oppressed and marginalized peoples within one's vicinity. That's what makes you a great ally. So I'm just gonna stop there because I'm sure as like we continue to chat, it's gonna become clearer and clearer. But that's what allyship means to me. You know, acknowledging one's positionality, one's privilege, and actually doing something about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that you're starting, I mean, from the very end of this, throwing in things around privilege, and we're gonna get to that very shortly. But let's kind of hone that a little bit, and thank you for that. I knew we weren't gonna get like a textbook definition, which often always doesn't apply to real life, and just given the space that we're in today, why and how is allyship important to the work of community foundations, in your opinion?
Yeah, so the community foundations to begin with, like it's within the name. As community foundations, we are serving the communities. And that comes from including everyone who is part of that community. So when I look at a place like Vancouver, it's a very diverse city. When like any kind of metric that you can use to look at diversity within the city, whether it's gender, race, class, and that comes with a lot of inequalities. So as community foundations, the work that we are doing should be benefiting each and everyone. And that makes us allies because, you know, uh, regardless of how intersectional we might be, I don't think there is one single person of us who actually has all those various identities. So there are two levels to this, allyship as organizations, as community foundations, but also allyship as the individuals within those community foundations who are doing the work. So I realize in my work as a manager at Vancouver Foundation, there are things that the organization does that I support the organization to do, but there are also things that I should be doing as an individual within that organization to benefit the communities that we are serving. So I think of allyship in those two different levels. And like that helps me in my work and how I think about my work, the input as well as the output. So yeah, thinking of all the communities that we are serving and thinking of those who might not necessarily identify as who we identify to be, will help us understand how better we can be allies to those who identify differently and who might not necessarily be the very first people whom we think about when we are delivering those services, whether it's grants, whether it's programs that we have in various parts of our communities.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I like again that you kind of separated things, or you mentioned both sides of this coin, which is on one hand the institutional, the basis for us gathering in a setting like this is talking about, what's the role of our respective foundation or the institutions that we represent, but also understanding that there is an individual onus around the subjects of allyship, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. When I think of, when you kind of unpack some of what's in that word. For me, I think ally, I think action, I think about listening, I think about learning, and then yielding. And again, we can talk about some of these different aspects, but let's talk about that aspect of listening, which I think is a crucial part. First, you need to listen, attempt to understand before you take action. I think that's really, really important. So how can community foundations learn and listen to the differing experiences of diverse groups, and how different factors come together to impact outcomes for particularly equity deserving groups?
Mm. Yeah, okay. I'm going to attempt to respond to the first half of the question, and then you will remind me the second half of the question. I feel like it's a big question, and it will be very hard for me to do it justice. But the listening piece first, again, I work at Vancouver Foundation. Vancouver Foundation serves the entire province of British Columbia, and Vancouver Foundation prides itself to be a learning organization. Pretty soon you're going to be celebrating 80 years of history, and I don't know how much learning we've done over the past 8 years. I definitely see a shift in the past, like 8 years, particularly the past 3 years following George Floyd. And I mentioned this because listening is learning. So how can community foundations listen? First and foremost, we have to hire diverse staff actually the true representation of the communities that we are serving. That has not been true at Vancouver Foundation, and I'm pretty sure in many other community foundations across the country. Like we are getting a little more diverse at the moment, but even then, when you look at the top, the board composition that we have, the senior leadership levels that we have, you don't see a lot of representation. So listening starts by having diverse representation, because if you have diverse representations, it's in those top level meetings that people are actually going to be like, hey, actually pause. I don't think that includes the Black communities or the indigenous communities. So I don't think that's like fair for people who are living with disabilities. So that's the first part, having diverse representation at all levels of our staff composition, our volunteers, and all that. Secondly, get into the community. Like we keep saying, community foundations. And I know many community foundations actually do have like different kind of services, different programs that allow them to get into the communities. At Vancouver Foundation right now, I mean, like 8 years on, we are serving the whole province. But up until 3 years ago, when Zoom necessitated that we get online, we did not have staff in different parts of the province. So if we are not in the communities that we are serving, it will be very, very hard to listen to the needs of those communities and ways we can actually be better allies in those communities. So getting into the communities, whether that's by having staff who live in those communities, whether that's by, like volunteer cohorts, or even doing community engagement work, like surveys, that kind of stuff. But we have to really create opportunities for the community members to come and let us know what they want and how best we can serve them. Now, can you please remind me the second part of your question?
Yeah, no, the second part being how you've now stated the importance of having this kind of perspective that includes everyone, but what kind of potential does that have to impact or determine outcomes for different equity deserving groups?
Oh, it's a lot. It's really a lot. The first part is, a sense of ownership that comes from being listened to. As community foundations or any other organization, if you are making decisions and then going into communities to say, hey, I think this is amazing. This is going to benefit you in A, B, C, D. Without them having been part of the process, it's going to be very hard to get the buy-in. But if you start by doing that engagement, that listening piece, then people know that they have influenced whatever the outcome of what you are planning to do, whether that's a granting launch, whether that's a program launch. And that's going to create a sense of ownership for them, which means they're actually willing to put in time and resources to also amplify the work that you're doing as a community foundation. So that's for me the best and biggest benefit that you can see coming from that listening piece. And also, I work with different partners from across the province to deliver the neighborhood small grants. And one of the things that I hear very often in our partners meetings is, you don't know what you don't know. And that's something that has really registered for me, because if we are not listening to the communities, we never know what we don't know about those communities and how best we can serve them. So it also helps us as community foundations to create programs and projects that are actually useful and that are going to meet the needs and the demands of our communities. So there is that increased self-awareness. There is also joy, when you create those relationships by cultivating that listening, you enjoy work more and more. I certainly see this in the work I do, and I see this in the work my colleagues do across the province as well, that when they build proper relationships with diverse groups, it's very easy to enjoy the work that you are doing. And that's important because this work can be very, very exhausting sometimes. Sometimes it feels like we are pushing the walls, whether that's the institutions that are holding us back. I work at Banco Foundation. It's not that what I want is immediately going to translate their systems and the structures that inhibit the ways what I would have liked for neighborhood small grants, for instance, or for other projects. So that the government comes in, the CRA regulations, there are just so many limitations that make this work quite exhausting, and it can it can feel emotionally draining. But when you cultivate those relationships, they become our anchor. And anybody who's been in a relationship knows that listening is the key piece to a successful relationship. In this case, between us as community foundations and the communities that you are serving. So that joy and feeling of fulfillment to actually do the work comes from listening.
Thank you, thank you. And so we just talked about learning and listening and how that's important, and of course how it impacts the on-the-ground work, which is germane to the work that we do within community foundations. Let's talk about the action and yielding part. One of the quotes I've heard around allyship is, the best allies are the ones who don't write it on their foreheads, or the best allies are the ones who are not exactly trying to take over. And maybe I'm answering the question a bit there, but what does meaningful action look like? What does it mean to go, if you may, alongside? What does it mean to yield, to ensure that the groups that need the support actually are able to support it? And what does a respectful process, allyship process, look like?
Yeah. So meaningful action, I would like to start by saying, and this is probably something that you all know, because it's said more and more often. When I do not act, I am complicit to whatever systems or operations that are happening. And I am a writer, so as a writer, I probably shouldn't be using cliches, but I'm going to utilize one right now. Actions speak louder than words. I've seen many organizations, and I think we talked about this actually in the last webinar last month. I've seen many organizations who, in June 2020, they made so many pledges of how much they are going to support Black communities following
Mm-hmm.
George Floyd. Um, and 3 years later, those pledges, most of them haven't gotten anywhere. I remember reading a Future of Good report like that. I think less than 3% of the funding. Um, I might be getting that statistic right, but it's very, very minimal. Less than 3% of the funding that was pledged to Black communities in 2020 actually ended up in the communities in the 2 years that followed. And you look at that, you're like, why? Those are the empty words. So for me, what that tells me, there are a lot of people who know what should be happening, but they
Mm-hmm.
don't do it. So when you do not act, you are immediately complicit to like the systems and the structures that continue to oppress. Um, Now, in terms of the tangibles that people should be doing, that we should be doing in our like various positions at work, and whether you do it for fairness, whether you do it because you believe in social justice, whether you do it because it makes a really good business case for your organization, like to be a good ally, first and foremost, you need to be uplifting like the oppressed change makers. So those members in your communities whose voices have been marginalized for so long should probably be the ones who are informing a lot of those meetings. Whether that's through formal consultations, which are paid, by the way, um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, normal and paid labor, especially for the like marginalized folks, whether like that's you actually, um, again, I talked about surveys. There are many ways that you can engage the communities, but putting in place the infrastructure within the organizations to actually make sure that people like from marginalized communities are listened to and they are the ones who are influencing the decisions that you are making. That's one. Um, and then there are like everyday small things that can be done. If like you identify as white or you're white passing and you're in a meeting with a Black colleague or an indigenous colleague, when they say something in that meeting, don't just keep quiet. Acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
Acknowledge that. Um, because what you're doing, you are continuing to validate. Um, you are continuing to validate whatever is coming from them, especially if it's in alignment, of course, with what you're trying to achieve. So acknowledging perspectives of marginalized communities as well. Uh, Standing up whenever there are cases of microaggressions, whenever there are cases of discrimination. For me, that's probably one of the biggest because especially I see this like in Western countries, generally speaking, um, where we are so caught up in our own lives and we don't want to get into anyone else's business, even when there are some injustices that are being performed. So you would pass by somebody getting beaten by the cops on the streets and look away rather than confront the situation and be like, hey, what's going on? So we don't want to look away. We want to actually engage and stand up whenever we are witnessing some forms of injustices. And that can range from your CEO, like speaking over the lower ranking staff who was going to mention something. And you, as maybe one of the mid-level managers or a director, saying, I don't think that was cool. Next time, let them express what they need to express, and then you can continue the meeting. So something like that, or it can be you sitting in those granting meetings and saying, I see that 80% of this granting money is going to the usual suspects, the institutions like universities, but what's going into the into those indigenous communities? What's going into that land-based nation in what we are doing right now? So it can really range, but it's having that courage that's going to inform the tangible actions that you are going to do to actually be a good ally. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I
Mm-hmm.
went everywhere with this,
No, but you
to
brought it
bring you back
all
in
back.
line.
You brought it together from going with, inaction is complicit to the need to acknowledge, and also something that you mentioned that kind of stood with me, just as basic as you asking the why. Why in the case of, black communities, for instance, all of these pledges and things that went out, just not seeing the result. And I want to delve into that a bit more. A part of me would think that a lot of that has to do with, power and
Mm,
privilege, the P word that you mentioned earlier, and some of the struggles that maybe leaders and power holding people have with ceding power, with sharing, if you may, power. And there can be no allyship without any of those factors playing in. There can be no allyship without empathy. There can be no allyship without humility. We talked about learning and listening. If there is no humility and openness to seeking knowledge, to gaining understanding, then we can't have pathways where we are sharing powers, or where we are even assessing or auditing how traditionally our institutions have run. And this brings
mm.
me to the next question: what does it mean to lead from a place of empathy and understanding, while recognizing privilege and oppression within institutions, in a bid to serve equity deserving groups?
Yeah. No, again, that brings me back to listening, amplifying where necessary, and getting out of the way where necessary as well. Um, leading with empathy, like, and compassion and understanding. There is a lot of humility that's necessary. There is a lot of inner work that's necessary to recognize that, maybe my dominant identity, I identify as a man. My dominant identity hasn't been really good um, for generations that has passed. Therefore, what can I do? There is a lot of introspection that has to happen. I'll give a very quick example. In my own relationship, like when my partner says, Njaba, what I need right now is like feminine energy.
Mm,
Immediately, what that tells me, okay, am I being too loud? Am I being too masculine? Am I being too imposing? And I have to do that in a way and then come back to her. Okay, how can I show up with that? And I think we all need to do that. Um, if you haven't taken time to actually reflect on your identities and how those identities impact the work that you do, especially in relation to those marginalized groups, this might be a good place to start. And in fact, that's the only place to start.
mm,
You can't not be an ally today and then tomorrow you are like, okay, I'm going to be championing Black Lives Matter. Is there any indigenous groups that's
mm,
looking for self-determination? Let's go.
mm,
Because you have to start by understanding who you are, where you come from, and how that's influencing where you are at. That's going to create the empathy. That's going to create the understanding. Um, and that's the scariest part too, I have to say, because it means you have to accept a lot of things that many people might not want to accept. We often talk about white fragility. You
mm,
know, it's coming from that. When I am white, um, and there are all these horrible things that are being said about my ancestors, what they need, like the chicken pox, the genocide. I can't take this anymore. If you haven't done the work, like if I am white and I haven't done the work to actually understand what that history is and how it has influenced where I am today in the present, it will be very hard for me to cultivate the place of empathy and understanding for
mm,
a Black Canadian whose generation, like 7 generations ago, the ancestors were shipped from Africa. And then 2 generations ago, the ancestors had to flee from from the US and come and establish themselves, it will be very hard. There is that cognitive dissonance that happens because they don't have that understanding of the self. So that's probably I'm actually going to stop there because I think that's the most important step, understanding one's positionality, one's history, one's identity, and then understanding how that shows up in the work that you are doing, in what you are saying in those meetings or those consultations, in how you are showing up on those doors you are knocking at, and the ways you are engaging those marginalized groups.
No, thank you for that. And, I really like that you mentioned you were speaking from the place of what you identify as and with. And I imagine that if we got any other equity, member of an equity denied group into this space, whether it's an indigenous person, I think we'll be coming back to the same thing, the need to the onus for each of us to do some work, to reflect, and to use parlance that I would use normally, to come correct when we show up, when we try to show up, not for, but with whatever group it is, Black, and whatever group we want to put in that blank space, to ensure that we do the work first. And part of that, as you rightly said, is showing up with humility. And you gave an example there that was teetering on the personal. And knowing a bit of your story, or having seen some of your journey over the years, I want to bring it to part of that personal. And you walked right into this at the beginning. You talked about the need to look at both the institutional and the individual in your own journey. And I don't know if that's something that you're able to share in this time, but knowing a part of the journey that led you here, how would you say individuals or groups of people or institutions, if you may, have showed up for you? What's the place of advocacy, and how do you continue to show up for others? I can answer that question knowing you, Jabba, but I think it's really important for people to know how people have showed up for you before and how you continue to show up for others.
Yeah. Oh, wow. How far back in my history do you want to go?
Let's go
It
to
was
the
two
very
days ago,
beginning.
or 2 decades ago. So yeah, I think this was mentioned in like in introducing me, when Kiri was introducing me, that I've lived in multiple countries. Like what it didn't mention is that in most of those countries I was actually a refugee. Now, for those of you who love mathematics and statistics, the number of refugees this year, 2023, skyrocketed. And I'm pretty sure if anyone is following what's going on right now in Israel and Palestine, that's also going to produce a lot more refugees. The last I checked, there are more than 120 million possibly displaced peoples. That's 4 times the population, or 3 times the population of Canada, to help you put that into perspective. So I happen to be one of those people. Up until a year ago, when I received the Canadian permanent resident. Right now, I'm stateless because I do not have a proper citizenship. Why is it important for me to give that background? I am one of those people whom you're probably meeting every day in those meetings, in those networking events, in the communities that you are in, and you might not know because I don't write it on my forehead, hey, refugee. And that's, I'm pretty sure, why Ruth is also asking me this specific question: how have people showed up in my life to support me? I'm going to be a very annoying author and say, please, if you can read my book, Refugee, the Journey Much Desired. It's a memoir that details some of my lived experiences as a refugee. And the reason why I'm recommending that, in relation to this question, you're going to see a lot of people who have actually stood beside me. From the very first refugee camp I lived in Malawi, and then in Swaziland, I have had people who were like, hey, I see you and I believe in you. So the people who have had the most impact have believed in me. They have actually believed that I'm more than what my identity says I am. And like translating that to the context of this meeting that we are like talking about right now, you know, if you're talking to somebody from like a marginalized identity, I'm from a place of empowerment, not from a place of like I've seen like some people in really condescending situations where they are like, oh, you are such a poor refugee. I wonder what I can do to help. No, I am a refugee, but beyond that, I'm human and I'm much more than that. So like people like Mark and Catherine, whom you were reading the book, who were like, hey, like we see you are doing everything that you can to succeed. Let's pay for your transport to go and take those entrance exams, to go and access internet and apply for university studies. They have made a difference. And then their mentors, people have looked at me and they're like, I see you are passionate about public speaking, or I see you are passionate about advocacy. I happen to know one or two things. Let me mentor you. In 2018, after my book was published, I had an interview with CBC. And after the interview, I received a number of emails. One of the emails was from a man by Eric Keys. Eric listened to this interview and he reached out through my website and said, hi, John Michael. John Michael is my legal name, and I still went by my legal name at the time. Hi, John Michael. I listened to your interview and I was very, very touched by your life experiences and your story. Would you be open to having dinner with me? Obviously, when you receive an email like that from the website, nonetheless, it's kind of spooky. So at first I was like, I don't know about this, but I opened myself to it. So I responded and said, hi, Eric, thank you so much. This is very kind of you. Let's have a phone call. This is a first date. I don't want to go in right away. I want to know the person first. And I gave him my phone number and he gave me a call and we talked. And then we had dinner and we became friends and he became my mentor. A year later, he helped me get some certification in project planning because that's his his area of expertise. He's been working in project planning and project management and process mapping for over 25 years. He's a white man. He knew very little about refugees or even like the Black experiences plural, in Canada. So him humbling himself and saying, I don't know exactly what you want in life, but I have these tools that I have been accumulating for over 25 years, and I can help you if you want. That was very, very meaningful for me. I've used some of the tools he's created to actually deliver on some work, including a youth learning center I was building in the refugee camp in Eswatini and some advocacy projects I was doing while I was still a student at UBC. Even doing my current work at Vancouver Foundation, I'm still utilizing some of the works, like the tools that he's created and given me. I still seek his mentorship. So this is, again, a very long-winded way of answering your question. The people who have had impact on me, first, they came from that positioning of humility. They really humbled themselves, realizing that no matter how much they read, or they listen to podcasts, or they watch TED Talks, they can hear and learn about the refugee experience, but they can never really understand what that means. So they come from that position of humility. And then they see me as somebody who is much more than my identity. They see me from that position of strength and abundance, of resilience, of everything that's possible. And then they want to amplify that. But even in doing so, they're not telling me what they think I should do. They're laying out what they have to offer, and they're allowing me to choose for myself what I need to actually continue paving my way. And I think everyone in this room can do that. Everyone in this room can offer.
That is so wonderful. I have one more question, but I don't even know if to bother to ask it because you encapsulated so much in there. And to everyone listening, I did share a link. Please follow the second one that I shared. Yeah, I promise it will be a very, very worthwhile read. You will feel like you're opening the pages of Jabba's life, which is essentially what that book is. So thank you very much for gifting that to the world, Jabba. Um, and then I was gonna say, one of the things that you mentioned is, I mean, you really underscored how people showed up for you. And if I'm asking a last question here, it would be, within the ambit of the work of the people that we have in the room today, how can they do something like that? In this case, we have the opportunity to hear your story, and I like how you mentioned, when you were talking earlier, you talked about identifying as a man, and obviously, we can assume that you're Black, and you did share that. But also, and I like the plurality that you used around your Blackness there, understanding that your story, my story, while there might be some similarities, there are some vast differences as well. And so, how can people recognize, knowing that not everyone will tell you first off? We've had the opportunity now to have you in this space twice. So I think we're building some rapport, some relationship. So there is a bit of comfort around you sharing like this. As we work in communities, that won't always be the case. So how can leaders in community foundations kind of extend that initial, if you may, that initial handshake invitation, as you've described? How can they show up tangibly in their day-to-day life or in their work life for communities that may not be so easily identified?
Yeah, well, Ruth, I hope it's okay if I actually disagree with what you just said, that
Please, yes. Oh,
building that
absolutely.
rapport and that relationship won't always be the case. I think it can always be the case if we are intentional enough. Yeah, I think it can always be the case if we are intentional, because regardless of what community foundation you are working at, whether big or small, I want to believe, so I'm a naive optimist, like most of the times, and it's brought me here, so I can only assume it's a good thing. I want to believe that most of the people who are involved in this work actually want to do the work. The nonprofit sector doesn't pay a lot. The nonprofit sector, it's a sector for passionate individuals. There is a lot of work, very minimal returns, and even the returns for most of the organizations who are invested happen over a generation, not the next day. If you're giving a grant to a community, unless they are building, a storytelling museum to showcase some of like their history, and the project is planned to take place over the next 3 years, then there is a tangible end in sight. Congratulations. I think most of the grants should be going to the communities to decide how they want to do it in ways that are actually going to help them generationally. And that's work that you are not going to see the results in the immediacy. So I want to believe that everyone who is doing this kind of work is really passionate, and they are not expecting immediate results from the work that they are doing. So starting from there, I think like I want to say, let's let go of all the assumptions that you might have about who the people we are serving are. Let's let go of all the expectations that we might have, like from people whose identities have been oppressed and marginalized for so long. And then let's build those relationships with them. Genuine relationships, not just a transaction.
Right.
Yeah, I've seen this like at Bangkok Foundation. I think we are slowly trying to move away from there, where there is a call for grants, and then there are grant applicants, there is a reviewing committee, the grant is awarded, that's it. The program like that I'm supporting Neighborhood Small Grants is one of the few that actually is founded on those principles of relationship building, where people in the community are in relationship with each other. And as the
Mm,
founder, and I hope this continues in all the other granting streams that we create, we kind of like step outside of it and allow the communities to take the lead.
right.
So removing the assumptions, removing the expectations, we can create that humility and then establish genuine relationships that actually help direct us to ways we can be like better allies. I wish I had like a 2 sentence magic phrase to say and say, hey, if you repeat this mantra every single day, you are going to be okay. But everyone in this room has to find their own way. And that
Mm.
only happens by doing that deep listening and then listening to the communities you're working with.
Oh, that's fantastic. You did say you threatened us by saying you didn't have a mantra, and then you said find your own way, which is how I would kind of sum all of this. So thank you so, so very much. And of course, I'm going to echo what I said at the beginning about I didn't expect you to come with like textbook definitions, knowing you are a storyteller and what you've taken us on today is a journey, bringing in just that mix of both the personal and the institutional. So thank you so much, Jabba. This has been a pleasure. I hope we get to see you again here, and I hope some of the people who are here would also reach out if you want to get to learn more about Jabba, about his work at the Vancouver Foundation, or just have virtual coffee. But thank you, and thank you to the CFC team for this opportunity to continue to connect. Kelly, I'm going to hand it right back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Sorry, I had myself muted. Java, thank you very much. I really appreciated both of your thoughtfulness and thoroughness on allyship. I also really appreciated the comment around intentionality and that optimism there. Java was really inspiring, and I appreciate that. I really think this is such an important topic, and I also think that a deeper dive could go into that participatory grant making that you speak of, Java, and I think that's a day's workshop in itself. And I think I look forward to learning more about those pieces. I recommend that we all continue to learn about and share your learnings with the rest of your organizations. Shifting power is only possible if we all do our part. So for our next CGE cohort, our next meeting is on October 18th, and we'll be diving deeper together on this topic. So please don't forget to join. And for all attendees, I believe we have a poll, and if so, if it pops up, please do answer that. It'll help us ensure all future webinars continue to be informed by those who are taking part. And in the chat, you're also invited there to join our upcoming events. And you can register for each event by clicking the event of interest. Please continue to watch our events page. And for CF members, watch our newsletter for upcoming events and resources. Thank you, everyone, and especially to Ruth and to Java for sharing today and again, making time for us. We really appreciate it. And have a great day.